Hi, your teacher again. I wanted to talk to you today about the Toulmin model of argument. This is in chapter 7 of your textbook, page 130. A lot of people have trouble with Toulmin. It's very new to many people. Here's the original book, The Uses of Argument by Stephen Toulmin. If by any chance you suffer from insomnia, I highly recommend it. Put you to sleep just like that. Here's the deal. We already talked about induction and deduction. I talked about how Aristotle came up with these ideas of how we think. Stephen Toulmin, back in 1958, wrote this book. He wrote it because he felt that Aristotle was nice in theory, but he, in practice, thought that it didn't really operate that way. That, in other words, that people's arguments were actually more complicated, more complex, and quite frankly, a little bit more dynamic. That is to say, we didn't always use neat syllogisms when making our arguments. And so what Toulmin did is he looked at real arguments, mostly in the academic world, but they're still arguments. And he then devised this different sort of system. Some parts of it make total sense and are very easy to understand because they're not that radical, but there are a few differences. So Toulmin begins with the idea that we have reasons for something, and that moves us across to what he called the claim. Think of the claim as your thesis statement, okay? So if you say the death penalty should be abolished, that would be a claim. Now, Toulmin argued there were three types of claims. Claims of fact, you guys have written an argument of fact. Claims of value, we're going to steer clear of those. And claims of policy, where you argue that something should be done, like the death penalty should be abolished, the drinking age should be lowered to 14, that kind of thing, right? And since we understand that nobody's really going to accept anybody's argument just because they say so, the concept of reasons is very clear as well. That is, you have to show why you're going to say that claim. So if you say the death penalty should be abolished, you have to have some reasons why. Now, one of the things that Toulmin noted, though, was that the reasons kind of divided up into two major types. The first was evidence. Evidence would be things like facts, statistics, data, examples, even opinions of experts, logic, and sometimes personal experience. All that would qualify under evidence. On the other hand, he also talked about appeals. And there were two major types of appeals, to needs and values. It's not that hard actually to think about this, because in our own time, in our own social milieu, if you will, there are many arguments, for instance, like the death penalty being one of them, that a lot of times don't rest nearly as much on evidence as on values. So, for example, if you value all human life, you say that all human life is sacred, nobody should be executed because all human life is sacred, even if the person has done horrible crimes. Well, that's a value statement. It's kind of hard to argue values back and forth, which is one of the reasons we don't do it in this class, because you just get a clash of competing values. But that is what happens in our society at large all the time. Abortion, death penalty issues, women's rights, gay rights. A lot of arguments that have gone on in our country's history actually have been a lot of times about arguments of value. Now, sometimes values will change over time. Think about the argument for slavery. Not too many folks are going to embrace an argument for slavery in this time, 2018. But if you went back 200 years ago or 160 years ago, you would find people who would be in favor of slavery, and really, in many cases, on the basis of values. Now, our values on this issue have changed, thank goodness, over the course of time. But, of course, then it popped up with segregation and Jim Crow laws. Opposition to civil rights was often based on values. Now, you might not embrace those values, but they were values. And this is one of the reasons why some topics, like for instance abortion, don't seem to go away so well, right? Why? Because the values are still clashing. Another point is that needs connect to values. What you value is very definitely dependent on what you need. Simple example, guns. I live in a relatively safe environment, and as you can tell, I'm on the wrong side of 50. I have never needed a gun in my life. Never really wanted one either. And so if somebody comes up with a measure, a bill, for example, to limit access to guns, I got no problem with it. But imagine I lived in a high crime area where police are not dependable, they may even be hostile to the population, or I live very far away from civilization, like out on a farm or a ranch or just out in the woods somewhere, and there's really no police help, at least not within a timely fashion. I then might value gun ownership, and I would oppose any restrictions on the rights to own a gun. So you can see, for instance, with the gun situation, that a lot of it has to do with your needs. Your needs give rise to your values. Now, the part that makes Toulmin, I think, pretty interesting, and a lot of students find it very confusing, is that what Toulmin recognized was it wasn't just enough to have your reasons and say that the reasons supported your claim. There was actually a dynamic action going on, what he called the warrant. When you think of a warrant, think of the word warranty. If you buy a sofa, a television, a toaster oven, a car, a lot of times it comes with a warranty. And what does that mean? It guarantees that that bed, that toaster oven, that car will function properly for a certain period of time, 90 days, 6 months, whatever, right, depending on what you're getting. So the warrant is kind of a guarantee, okay? It guarantees that the reasons cross over to the claim. So for example, a value warrant means I share the same values. So if I'm making an argument against ownership of guns, and I think guns should be restricted, and you also live in an area where you feel pretty safe and you don't feel it necessary to own a gun, you may share my value. And therefore, when I say we don't need guns, and I give my reasons why, you're a very sympathetic audience. But if you don't share my values, right, you don't share that value warrant, it doesn't matter what I say, what examples of crimes and accidents and suicides, all that stuff doesn't matter to you. Why? Because you have a different value. So the value warrant is one kind of warrant. Another kind of warrant is the authority warrant. The authority warrant says, I trust the sources that are telling me the evidence, right? This usually applies with evidence, right? And so if I'm, for example, writing a paper, let's say I want to write an argument of fact on the benefits of a vegan diet. Vegan. Okay, I don't go there. But let's imagine I did, okay? And I have all kinds of wonderful examples and data and facts that I got from vegan activists, vegan websites, vegan publishing houses. Somebody might look and say, but nobody has a foundation in medicine here. Nobody has a foundation actually in nutrition. Nobody seems to really know anything about human physiology. All your sources are biased. Therefore, the authority warrant would say, no good. I have to trust the authorities. They have to be credible, reliable, authoritative. And if they're not, it doesn't matter what they say, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many times Weekly World News tells me that we're about to be invaded by Martians. I'm not too worried. Why? Because I don't trust them. So, trusting the authority is another kind of warrant. A third kind of warrant basically is what I generally call the use of evidence warrant. Is the evidence being used fairly, accurately, appropriately, Or are people cherry picking examples, making hasty generalizations with just a few statistics? Maybe sometimes the statistics are valid, but they're old. They're too old. They don't reflect the current reality. So they were good 20 years ago, but they don't reflect what's going on now. Claim, reasons, warrants. These are the central parts of the Toulmin model. Let's just take a quick peek into the textbook. If we turn to page 137, okay, you'll forgive the glasses. The editors of your textbook present three types of arguments, or three arguments, I should say, with claims, reasons, and warrants. To help understand the difference between these, they've added some helping words. The word since at the beginning of the warrant, establishing the assumption or the premise, right? The word so at the beginning of the claim, which gives us a sense that this is a logical conclusion. So on top of page 137, it says e-cigarettes legitimize smoking among youth and entice children by using flavors like bubblegum. Okay, so that's a piece of evidence. You can look outside and see that, right? Everybody can see that. The claim says, so the federal government should ban e-cigarettes in all public places. But here's the problem. You have to have the warrant. It says, since the Constitution was established to promote the general welfare and citizens are thus entitled to protection from harmful actions by others. Now, who would disagree with that? Well, actually, quite a lot of people would. Not just the makers of e-cigarettes, but people who think that the government should stay out of being so overprotective, if you will. The next example, Electoral College gives small states undue influence, so it should be abolished. The warrant says, since no state should have undue influence on presidential elections, right? Presumably, a lot of people might agree with that, unless you're from Wyoming, in which you kind of like having undue influence. Third one, here's an interesting one. I've been drinking since age 14 without problems, so the legal drinking age should be lowered. And this is based on the warrant that what works for me should work for everyone else. I think it's a pretty questionable warrant there, right? Use of evidence. Has it really worked for you? If you've been drinking since you were 14, probably not, actually. But you see how the argument works. The support doesn't automatically cross over to the claim without the warrant functioning as a bridge. Now, warrants are not the same thing as evidence. That's the biggest mistake a lot of my students make, is they jump to the idea of, oh, evidence, evidence, evidence. No, that's all part of the reasons, or what we might call generically the support. The warrant is often an unstated assumption, a generalization that connects and joins the two statements together. So as you're putting together your proposals for me for the rest of the semester, you need to be thinking about what are the assumptions that are being made. One bit of advice, as I say, who would look at those reasons and still not accept the claim? Somebody who doesn't agree with the warrant. That's the key right there. If you can figure out who doesn't agree with the warrant, then you have an idea of what the warrant actually is. Okay, good luck.